Well, welcome to Madison, our Wednesday evening adult class. We are so thrilled to have you with us, and Frank and I, it means a lot to us that you want to be with us on Wednesday night, and that even some of you have talked about when we do get back to doing things in the building and all that you have an interest in our continuing to do this class, maybe a little bit different format, but this kind of class, these kind of discussions, and I certainly enjoy working with Frank, and I just miss you. It would be nice to have a live audience with us. We always have Buddy and Norma's pictures just right below the camera to keep reminding Frank and I to talk to you, not just to each other, and to try to be personal and conversational. And so we're very appreciative that as an expression of your love for Christ and for this church and for us, that you choose to spend time with us on Wednesday evening. It's really good. Now, Frank, Sunday I was in my sermon on Job. We were in Job 28 and looking at this idea of wisdom. Where can it be found? How do you find wisdom and understanding? And obviously, and I think we may talk a little bit more about that this coming Sunday, but obviously what's being discussed there is, in the Bible, there's kind of a wisdom of the world in contrast to wisdom of God's people. And that's a very strong theme when you look at the book of Proverbs, God's wisdom and acquiring that. But one of the things that I think is interesting is that Job's friends believe that they are really being wise. So they've got a couple of biblical principles that have become kind of rigid rules, and some of us in the Church Christ tradition are pretty good at that, changing kind of a principle that's kind of a guiding principle, and then we treat it almost as if it's an axiom that is rigid, and if you don't quite go with it, then, well, won't see you in heaven. So it becomes problematic. But his friends are so adamant, and they think they're being wise in the counsel and advice they're giving Job, and he's becoming increasingly hostile towards them. And you got this vicious loop going. So tonight, one of the things I wanted to do is continue to look at the idea of suffering and crisis, and I do want us to talk about that kind of the relational aspect of that, because when I suffer, I'm going through a crisis, it's pretty rare that I do it by myself, unless I'm Robinson Crusoe on an island and nobody's helping me out. And so there are these relational dynamics that are going on. So we've been talking about that some. But part of what we are looking for is this idea of, in our relationships with one another in a time of crisis, I do think the big question becomes, am I really being as wise as I think I am, or am I like one of Job's friends thinking that I'm wise, but what I'm doing is I'm creating a more difficult situation? So my first question is, did you have any reflections at all on Sunday morning sermon? And if you do, that's great. If not, then there's another passage I want to kind of move us to that will kind of help us lean into this idea of relational support in a time of crisis. So good to see you tonight.
Hey, good to see you. Well, I actually took notes on your sermon.
Look at that.
First time I've ever done that.
Ever? With me or with anybody?
Well, with anybody, maybe.
Wow.
So I did that.
Yeah.
But I think I had three things I thought, okay, we can talk about this, because it just, to emphasize again some of the things that were said there. But of course, the big topic was wisdom, like what you said. But you started out with about technology, and you were using the passage in that chapter was about mining technology, and ours has moved way past that to the internet and to communication technology. But it reminded me of a story that I'd read. One of the presidents, and I can't remember which one, this was around the end of the 1800s or the beginning of the 1900s, when the telephone first came on the scene, the first telephone they had in the White House. He refused to use it because he thought it was rude not to talk to somebody in person and to actually call somebody and interrupt them. He didn't like that, so he would not use the telephone. And it takes a long time, I guess, for people to get comfortable with technology, but we can see what a blessing it is. I mean, we don't want to always just paint a dark picture of it, because look what we're doing right now and how the world is having to communicate. Right. But the point was, technology is not the thing, wisdom is the thing, which is what you led to. And then you kept going with, well, it's not just wisdom. What is wisdom? It's a relationship with God. That is the ultimate wisdom. I know the world doesn't see it that way, but all of us who have lived long enough in our Christian life, we would say that is it. Being wise is having a strong relationship with God. And I think you were beginning to develop this, but it's even a relationship with God in the middle of suffering. It's not when all the things are going so well, like God is a genie in a bottle and he gets you whatever you want. That's not it. The relationship with God is really tested and at its supreme height and commitment when things are not going well, like in Job's life. That's when your commitment to God is at being tested, and when the wisdom really comes through, I know what works for me, and it's being connected to God no matter what. So that's what we see in Job. He is wanting to be connected to God no matter what, even though he just doesn't understand what's going on.
Right, he doesn't.
So that's my reflection.
And wisdom, and I do think that wisdom doesn't always give you the why of what's going on. Because it's obvious when you look at the description of wisdom, it's the fear of God and the shunning of evil. And in chapter 1 and 2, 3 times Job is described as a person who fears God and shuns evil. So that means he's on the path to wisdom, but he still doesn't understand why God is doing what he's doing. So it doesn't mean that if I have a relationship with God, I can figure him out. It means that in that relationship with God, very often I'm kind of like a child with a parent, and you've got a child. So there are times your child keeps asking, why, Daddy? Why? And there's sometimes where you can try to provide an explanation, but you know the explanation's inadequate. It's not really getting all the things, but they can't. So sometimes a child has to learn that at this point I can't get the why, or even the one that's given to me is not really as adequate as I want it to be.
Really, we show faith when we don't understand the why, and we accept that we never will, and that is perfectly okay.
Yeah.
I just trust God no matter what.
A lot of times I'm a little more comfortable with somebody who recognizes they have not figured God out, as opposed to Job's friends. I get irritated by Job's friends because they're so certain that they are correct. And their certainty makes me a little bit uncomfortable, because it's like if you question it, they're offended.
Well, they have truth, I guess, with the small t on their side. I mean, it is a general truth. If you do things well in life, good things will happen. So that's what they're going with. And all of us would say, yeah, that makes sense to us too. But there are the dramatic exceptions. I mean, good people have horrible things happen to them in life. And we see Job as an example. Of course, Jesus is the ultimate example of that. And so I think people who suffer and maybe don't have all the answers to it, I mean, and they're not even trying anymore to say, I've got to figure it out. It's just, I'm okay. I don't know.
And I think a good example that just came while you were thinking about that is in John 9, there's that story of the man who is born blind. And so the question his disciples asked Jesus is, well, who sinned, this man or his parents? Because they had working in their minds that same idea that to be born blind, somebody had to sin, somebody had to do something wrong. This is God's punishment. And Jesus' response to that was that this is for God's glory. Neither one sinned. It's for God's glory. And yet you can also see that there are times where Jesus, like even in the Sermon on the Mount, talks about if you do this, the consequences are that. So you have this really interesting challenge for all of us, and that is trying to understand God's Word and being students of it and reflecting on it, memorizing, understanding it, but still recognizing that there's this responsibility of applying it correctly. For example, if you get to the book of Proverbs, and so the first 9 chapters talk about wisdom a lot. So you have a father teaching his son wisdom. But you get into some of those Proverbs, and sometimes the proverb will seem to be saying one thing, and then maybe a little later on that chapter or 2 chapters over, you get a proverb that almost says the exact opposite. And so then you scratch your head. And I was with the group one time, and one of the things I told the people in the group is I think sometimes with these proverbs, the sign of wisdom is you know when to apply this one in this situation, and that you need to apply this one in that situation, because not all situations are the same. And we want it to be nice and neat and kind of button it down, kind of like your shirt is all buttoned down. But a lot of times it's just not quite the way it works.
Well, good point. We want it to be easy for us to understand, like raise up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. And we have great comfort when we think about that, but then our children make bad decisions and off they go down a bad path, and then, hey, we feel guilty. We must have done something wrong. I mean, there's a general truth, raise your child well, but there's also the other truth out there that we all are responsible for our own decisions.
We are.
So we've got two maybe conflicting thoughts there. So like you're saying, wisdom is figuring out which to apply.
One of the things, yes, and one of the things we also bump into is I think that passage emphasizes the parents' responsibility for raising the children, being mindful of that and responsible. But you also, especially in our culture, there comes a time where at school and all that, you are releasing your children into an environment that is tremendously, there's a lot of pressure and things that go on with that, as well as the role of media. So you talked about the technology, but that technology that can be wonderful, bring great things into your life. So we hope that this technology brings something good in your life, a word of encouragement. But at the same time, there's a lot that can come into your child's life through that same technology, that same computer screen that you're using tonight. There are things that can come in that become a real problem for children, and it goes back to trying to raise a child in the way so that when we do allow them the freedom that, so as they get older, we give them more freedom, right? But that's really risky. But
being a parent means you're taking a risk.
It does.
Because you can't control the environment, nor should you.
Yeah.
Because they've got to learn how to take risks and manage it and grow stronger from it.
Yeah.
About technology, I've had a very frustrating week with technology this week.
Can you tell me about it?
Just trying to get a new phone. I mean, I've spent hours on the phone with different providers trying to figure all this out and been on hold for several hours. I mean, very frustrating. But going back to maybe it's more important. I mean, I would say, God, please help me with this. Please help me find a representative to talk to on the phone quickly. But then I started thinking, well, maybe the wisdom of this is how do I carry myself well even when I am frustrated? When I do go in and talk to somebody, am I going to be a jerk? Am I going to be sarcastic? Am I going to curse? No, I'm not going to curse. I mean, how am I going to be? Maybe that's more important than just getting the answer from God quickly and easily that I'm looking for.
Yeah.
That's wisdom, living your life well even when things aren't going so well.
And that's kind of a good transition to the passage I thought we might talk about some tonight.
Okay.
So because wisdom is, once you start working with the idea of wisdom as it's treated in Scripture, you keep bumping into passages, you go, oh my, it's right there. So when we were working with the book of Ephesians, one of the things in Ephesians chapter 1, Paul prays that we might be given the spirit of wisdom and revelation so that we might know God better. So Paul is praying that you and I be given the Spirit of God so that we could know Him. So just like we saw in this in the passage in Job, where it's talking about that the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. That there's this recognition that God is God and I'm not. That I stand in awe of God, wonder of God, respect of who He is, But I don't just do that on my own. So Paul is praying that God's Spirit would be given to me because I'm a child of God. And that's the imagery used in Ephesians 1, that because of who God is and what He's done, He wants to approach us as a loving Father, and that through the work of Jesus Christ, we are adopted and we can have this experience of being children of God. And so, but he also prays that we'd have the Spirit so that we can have this wisdom and revelation that allows us to more adequately come to understand God. So Paul picks this idea up a little bit later in Ephesians chapter 4. So I love Ephesians chapter 4, verses 1 through 16, but we don't have time to go through that tonight. But that's Paul's vision of what it is to be church. And one of the things I am so theologically committed to is that in so many places, people just ignore Paul's vision of what it is to be church and this kind of interrelatedness of our lives together and how important that is. And it's a part of what it is to become a mature person. So I think you can listen to sermons and listen to Christian music and never develop much spiritual maturity, but you can also go to church a lot and not develop much spiritual maturity. But if you take seriously what Paul is talking about in those first 16 verses, you see the part of what he's talking about is that we're supposed to be so related to one another and engaged and involved in each other's lives. Place already in Ephesians is there is a transition from being wise according to the world and the way the world operates and does things, the way they live, and now being in Christ, there's a new way of operating that Paul says is expected of all of us. That this relationship with Christ is not just about my going to heaven, it's about you and me becoming new people. It's about the group that normally would gather here becoming a new humanity that is modeled not on the cultural terms of what it is to be in relationships and do all that, but it's modeled on Jesus Christ. So beginning in verse 17, he says, so I tell you this, and I insist on it. So he's not just going, oh, this suggests if you like it, good. If you don't, well, do whatever you want. He goes, I insist on it in the Lord that you must no longer live as Gentiles do in the futility of their thinking. So when we're talking about wisdom of God, we're talking about the mind, the development of the mind, so that it begins to now be formed like the mind of Christ. And that's, so Paul will use this, for example, in Romans chapter 12, verse 2, where he talks about don't be conformed to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. There's supposed to be an emergence of a different way of thinking. So he says they're darkened in their understanding. So in Job, he talks about wisdom and understanding. So he's talking about this life apart from God means a darkness in understanding. They're separated from the life of God because of the ignorance that's in them due to the hardening of their heart. They've lost all sensitivity. They've given themselves over to sensuality so as to indulge in every kind of impurity, and they're full of greed. Now listen to what he says. That, however, is not the way of life you learn when you heard about Christ and were taught in him in accordance with the truth that is in Jesus. So that's why if we avoid really paying attention to the teaching of Jesus, we're missing something big.
He's talking about a changed life.
A changed life, a changed mind, a changed life, behavior.
Mind and life, yes.
He says, you were taught with regard to your former way of life to put off the old self, which has all these practices and behaviors, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires, to be made new in the attitude of your mind. So your thought world, what is going on in your head is as important as what it is you're doing. And to put on a new self, now this is stunning, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. And then Paul begins to talk about a number of things, and his pattern is put off this, put on that. So let's just look at the first two, and I think that will be, and we can apply this to relationship. I think the first two will probably take up our time. He says, therefore, each of you must put off falsehood and speak truthfully to your neighbor, for we're all members of one body. And then he says, in your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you are still angry, and do not give the devil a foothold.
There's a lot there.
So if we look at these two things, number one is in relationship, the idea of truth telling. How important is that really? And there, a little bit later, he talks about speaking the truth in love. And I think that's really an important qualifier. So there's this idea of truth-telling and the impact on relationships, and also not that you ever get angry, but I do. So
I get angry.
Yeah, I know.
Okay.
So,
all right.
but just what anger, the dynamic anger brings to relationships, because we're talking about being in a crisis situation, and that's why we're looking at all this. And in these relationships, dealing with truth-telling in love, and somehow working with my anger so that it doesn't become sinful behavior, and it's not something I just keep stuffing. So why don't you, what do you have any thoughts on one or one of those to start off with? Okay.
Both. The speaking the truth in love, to me, that is a good of description of counseling. What I do is anything that you can come up with. It's speaking the truth in love. I mean, some people have difficulty speaking the truth because they don't want to hurt anybody.
Right.
Make sure they don't say anything that anybody would disagree
Don't
with.
even call that loving.
Yes.
Because they don't want to hurt you.
Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, you got people bouncing. Some people are harsh in what they say, and they're not loving because they're speaking the truth and proud of it, which may have been more like Job's friends, versus some people who have difficulty telling you the truth because they don't want to hurt you in any way. So here is the perfect balance, speaking the truth in love. I would call that wisdom, being able to do that well. And we aspire to do that. None of us do it perfectly well.
So you're a therapist. Do you ever really struggle with, so you had this insight, you know it's a thing that needs to be said, but do you struggle with, can I say this?
Yes. And that's my struggle primarily. I lean toward the side of not being just truth-telling enough. I will soften it, sweeten it, and maybe there's some wisdom in that too. I want to communicate the truth. I just want to do it in a way that doesn't upset people.
So are you more, Carl Rogers, is it non-directional?
Yes.
Non-directional. So you
I'm
tend to be
more
more
like
that?
Yes, I am.
So I remember, because there were a few years where I would go to therapists with my ex-wife, and but one of the therapists we used it was not this non-directed therapy. I mean, it was very confrontational, which I didn't mind, but it was very different styles from the other.
And there's value with that too. I mean, sometimes when I'm talking to people, don't sugarcoat it. Just tell me what you're thinking and feeling. You don't have to do that for me. I'm strong enough to hear it. So that's why, again, the balance that's there. So that's one of it. And the whole thing about anger that's being brought up, I think Christian people have a problem with anger because we're taught to be nice people, and anger doesn't fit that mold very well, so we don't know what to do with it. So many people I know just stuff their anger continually. I mean, that's how we were raised. Maybe there's been more freedom for men to express anger. That's manly. But for women particularly, it's just being sweet and don't say things. I mean, that was my generation. Maybe it's changed over the course of time. But I think there's been a history of doing a lot of swallowing of anger, which kind of ties back into some of our first discussions, since I say that's what leads to depression in so many people. So I know it's not a good thing to swallow your anger. You just have to learn to say it well and use your words well, where it doesn't go underground inside of you and even cause worse things. So when it comes to like marriage couples, you're referring to that. I mean, that's one of the biggest challenges for married couples. It's learning what to do with your anger, what to do with your anger. And most of us don't do very well with it. We've learned what to do with it. We've watched mom, we've watched dad. We've learned what to do, but somehow we have to, follow the biblical pattern here and figure out the new way to do it that is best. Some of us have had great models and some of us haven't.
So when you think about people who know how to handle themselves when angry, how would you describe somebody who does a good job being angry and at the same time being able to talk about it in a way that's not destructive?
All right. I think the first key is learning to slow yourself down, because we get into trouble when we act rashly, quickly.
Yeah.
And I think there's wisdom. And I mean, we used to teach children in some of the anger classes I would have. I mean, just the old system of counting to 10. But I mean, in our Christian life, like if we have a Bible verse, we can say to ourselves just to slow the train down before we rush off in some type of angry tirade. Just something to say to slow it down before we react. I mean, I would say that's the key, the first key.
Yeah.
And figuring
So
out how
to
to
write
do
with
it.
that, when I used to do stories with fourth graders, I had a couple of different stories on anger that would kind of help get that point across. So, but one of the things I talked about was how I think there are different people who talked about that counting to 10. But one of the illustrations I used to talk about, I said some people, they talk about the counting to 10, and basically what they mean is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, pow! And that's not the point. That's not the point.
No.
The point is, and I told some of them, I said, you need to count slowly, because the point is to cool off so that you're not embodying the anger, either in what you say or what you do physically. And one of the things I point out is some of you have such a problem with anger, you need to count to 100 very slowly, because it's going to take at least that long for you to bring it under control. But let's say this. So let's say that I'm in marriage counseling, and I've explained to you that anger is a problem for me. That I end up saying lots of things. I throw things and all that. So you're going to speak the truth to me in love. And so what are some of the techniques that you would teach me if I've got a problem with anger, so that it floods me and my whole body gets tense and I can't stop myself? Or I find it hard. Number one, I'm sure you'd say, don't say you can't. You probably would say, okay.
You're choosing not to.
You're choosing not to. So if I'm going to choose to, what's some homework assignments that you would give me to help me better work with my anger, not with only my wife, but with my children and at work? Because if it's showing up at home, now there is that pattern that you probably have seen where people present the really nice person out there in public.
Right.
And then when they get home, they are really scary.
They
but nobody
explode.
really sees that unless you're at home.
Yeah.
So, but let's say that I'm the kind of person, I'm blowing up at work. When I'm driving my car, I got the road rage thing and all that. And I'm having trouble maintaining friendships, and I've come to you a broken man. And so what you're going to do is you're going to help me figure out some patterns of behavior. What are some things that you would teach me to do?
I have a couple thoughts. One thing I've learned that's been very helpful is I don't ask what's made you angry. I ask what has hurt you. It's reframing it, because I really think pain lies below the anger. Anger is just an overflow of pain. Something has hurt you in life, like a violation of your trust or expectations, or some loss that you've had. Something has hurt you. So I think it's better to say, what's hurt you, not why are you angry? And I think too, like if you're talking to your mate, I think it's better to say not why are you so angry, it's what's hurt you. Help me to understand that. It puts it in an entirely different light than anger, but a truer picture to me, the underlying pain.
Yeah. And it allows that person to show some compassion, recognize you're hurt.
Yes.
And Aristotle, I think, talked about that he felt like that one of the main causes of anger is what he called unjustified slight. So when somebody does something to you, it hurts you, like when somebody cuts you off on the interstate. Now, when they do that, they may not see you. It may be that you're in their blind spot and they cut you off, but you feel slighted. You feel like they put you in danger, and all of a sudden and it's not even calculated.
No.
It is kind of animal response of, you just endangered me, and that's kind of triggered all that.
Right. And that's when we have to slow ourselves down rather than reacting, and going back to the power of our cognition and changing minds. I mean, someone might cut you off in traffic and you have an entirely different reaction than me because you're telling yourself something different, like that's a jerk, he did it on purpose, where I might choose to say, oh, it was the blind spot. He didn't see that I was in this blind spot, and it's okay. And I'm listening to the calm music channel intentionally, and it's like, hey, it's okay. Or, that role could be reversed. I might be the one that gets explosive, but it's about, what you're telling yourself in your mind. And I think it's like with your mate too, when you're in some type of angry discourse with them. I mean, you can choose to tell yourself, hey, this is a despicable person in front of me who I don't like right now. Or you can choose to say, but I really love this person, and we're allies in life. We're partners. We're on the same team. Why am I going to attack my partner? And I know in marriage, you want it to be a win-win in any type of argument that you have, not where you're out to win the argument. You automatically lose if you're out to win the argument. Because I believe it's either a win-win or a lose-lose.
Yeah.
So I want to win the relationship, not necessarily win the argument. Now, I don't do this perfectly well. Bring Diane up and she can tell you that.
Can we bring her next week and interview her?
No, do not bring her up.
If you want that to happen, why don't you give me a call this week and we'll see if we can't arrange something.
No.
Because then he'd be bringing Jackie in, and that would be really embarrassing.
Well, we know what to do, but we don't always do it well, obviously. Yeah.
And I think one of the major causes of anger is that sense of being hurt. I think there are some people, and once again, a lot of it is wiring, but I do think that there are a lot of people who feel like that there are rules that are to be followed. And the violation of the rule triggers, because it's like that's, everybody knows they're supposed to be done that way. And so I think sometimes, whether that fits the pattern of that I'm hurt as much as it does
a violation of your expectation of how it should be.
Should be, ought to be, and I've got this kind of really firm conviction of it. And there are a lot of people who grew up in our tradition who have certain rules, and you violate that, and they're angry. They might come up to you after service and go, "Do you know what you did?" And that's never a good thing, is it? That finger pointing, that's...
Yeah, we talked about don't point fingers. But, I mean, do you want to create a grace-based family or not? And the answer is, of course you do. We want to have a grace-based family with our children, with our spouses. And they're not going to follow all the rules properly that we have in our own mind, and neither do we.
Yeah.
But we offer ourselves grace. We offer them grace.
Yeah. So what are some other things you recommend to me if I were coming to you and say, I've got an anger problem? So part of that is you might recommend my spouse ask me why I'm hurt. Yeah. But if you're going to be talking to me, like I think a lot of people don't know how to talk about their anger. They know how to vent it, but they don't really how to talk about it. So what were some guidelines that would help me be truthful about my anger, but in love with somebody?
Well, yes, and let me get to that. But what you just said is important, too. Some people only know how to vent with the idea that the louder you are, the stronger your point is. So the point is to be louder than your spouse or your family, and you're making your point and winning the argument, and that's going to explode on you anyway. I mean, you might intimidate the person until they're quiet and obedient for a while, but that's not really making anything better in your family. So venting is not good. But I think sometimes people do vent because they don't feel heard. So sometimes it is taking a lot of time to talk about things. Okay, what is making you hurt, or what is making you angry, whatever way you want to say it. And let's take time undistracted to really talk about that. And then perhaps when you feel heard, it will sort of dissipate some of that angry feeling. But I mean, in the rush world we live in, where I think I read the average family, maybe it's changed because of the virus, but they typically talk 17 minutes a week besides just logistical things. I mean, important things. where we don't even have time to talk about the important things anyway.
Yeah.
You know, that could be frustrating and that could build up anger in me. I really have things I want to say and communicate to you, but you're not giving me time. You're in a rush, I'm in a rush, and so it's eating at me all the time. So just taking the time to do it, like, okay,
Right.
tonight at 8 o'clock, from 8 to 9, or let's really talk about what's hurting you and why you're angry, and I want to know. You tell me all of it. Drain the cup. You know, let's hear it.
Okay, but if you, for example, if you
Yeah.
ask me, if you say, Russ, I just want to know, like, let's say we had a bad thing, and you knew I was angry, you go, Russ, I want to know all of it. For me to feel that really, I'd have to believe that you meant that. Because there are
Yeah.
some people, if you really share what's going on inside, you go, this is not going to go well. And I think a lot of marriages, if you do, not in that loud voice or whatever, but really share what's going on, I think there are a lot of people, not just marriages and friendships, at work, who feel like the thing that you said, because you said, I just want to know what's going on, 3 weeks later, it comes back to haunt you because that line is now taken out of context and go, well, you know, you said, and then bam, you feel like it's being used as a weapon.
I think it goes back to what you read in Ephesians. I mean, if the church community, if we're really supposed to be like this, then it means that we take the time to do this. And in marriages, a lot of times we don't. And in church settings, I mean, we're good at being a crowd, an audience, but
Not a community.
not a community. And that's what you're pointing to. That's what the scriptures are pointing to. We're a community where I really want to get to know you, which implies it's going to take a lot of time getting to know. I mean, it might be, in marriages in that context, hours of discussion of, hey, I really want to know you and what's bothering you genuinely.
Yeah.
You know, that's how we build our bond between the two of us. So, yeah, it takes a lot of time to do that.
Yeah. I remember when I was in therapy, one of the things that was very early discussed was the idea of kind of framing it in a way so that you talk about, so when you said this to me, I felt. And so instead of kind of going at the person with my anger, I talk a little bit more objectively about the feeling instead of just expressing it, directing it at you, that I find a way to make it a little safer for the other person. Because I do think that there is, in some ways in our culture, that idea of venting as being the way you do things. And one of the things I found, Frank, I don't know if you see this or not, but I've seen the idea of venting is very often it gives kind of temporary relief, but it doesn't really solve the anger that I have. And what I do is I vent with this person and that person. And my goal in venting with people, that's not the person I'm mad at. I'm mad at Frank. And so then I start to talk to you and to you and to you about you, right? And so my venting is to get you all to agree with me that he's a bad guy. And so I tell my story when you're not around.
Yeah.
I tell my story my way. I make it look like you're the bad guy. I'm the innocent guy. And if you were telling the story, you might go, no, wait a minute. You just left out all these important facts, but I'm just hoping that you'll never really talk to them, but they'll be angry at you with me. And that's one of those kind of really devious uses of anger that creates very sinful dynamics in the body and does a lot of damage.
Well, that's passive aggressive, like what we talked about in weeks before. If I'm talking to someone about you rather than to you, that's an indirect, unfair way. It may bring momentary relief, like what you said, hey, somebody's on my side, but it doesn't solve the problem. I remember when I used to cut my grass, that there were some weeds that would always grow back in the back line of the property there, and I could cut them down every week and make it look good until the next week, and they would come back up again. I mean, it's not dealing with the real problem there. So I think we're kind of good at just kind of, hey, making it look good, skimming the surface, when it's going to take more time and effort than that, which we don't want to do. We don't want to give the effort to.
It's hard work.
Yes, and so we prefer to skim the surface and cut the weeds, but not really resolve anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, I'm guilty
So
of that
do
too.
you know people who are just kind of angry personalities?
Yes.
So do you find it hard to be a friend with somebody who's got an angry personality?
Yes. Yes.
You don't want to elaborate that, no.
Well, I'm thinking of people, but I'm not going to say it.
Oh, I know, no, I'm not asking you to say the names, but
No, and it's, what I was really hesitating on is I was about to say in the Christian community, it seems like we have a lot of angry people. And I don't know if I have all that figured out. Why is that so? I mean, who may live their lives properly following the rules, but on the inside, they're just downright angry.
they are. And I think sometimes, I've known people who will, everybody who knows them goes, they're just an angry person, but you talk to them and they go, I'm not angry. Which is a weird kind of thing because everybody else is recognizing you've got more anger than you know, but it's kind of it's their kind of normal way of presenting, and it's almost like they're not aware that they are coming. So if they're not angry, they're coming across as angry, and sometimes even a bully because they bow up, and all this is starting to come towards you. And what I find is that kind of person it's very hard to have a friendship with somebody like that because you don't know when it's going to tip, and when it does, you feel like you're in danger.
And the sad truth is they're the ones that need the friendship the most, and they drive people away by their behavior, and they're not even aware of it at times.
Or even if you speak the truth in love to them, they deny it. So it's that not aware, but it's almost like the resistance is there to look at and go, I'd never realized that. So it's one of the things I had to learn in therapy. One of the things I had learned was I would sometimes go, well, I'm not angry. I'm just frustrated. And my therapist finally said, did you know that frustration is just a low-burning anger? And that stopped me in my tracks. So then what that meant was I had to stop saying I'm not angry. I had to recognize that when I said I'm frustrated, I was saying, yeah, I am angry. I'm not that full-blown rage, but there's that anger in that much smaller form, and trying to become more aware, not that I can make it work all the time, but trying to become more aware of those kind of early warning signs when that's in me. I can tell sometimes, and sometimes I don't intervene, and I still just stay frustrated and it comes across, and then what that means is, and I think this is very important, if you have an anger problem, I think this is really important. You need to become really good at acknowledging what I said to you, the way I handled that was inappropriate and it was wrong, and I need you to forgive me.
And let me say there's hope too, because that's what we're reading in Scripture. I mean, our relationship with God is meant to change us.
Meant to change it.
Our mind and our behavior. And so it's not hopeless if we've got one of those anger problems, whether we know it or not. The more we give ourselves to God, I mean, that's what the fruit of the Spirit does.
That's right.
He just unconsciously works within us to produce the fruits of the Spirit. I don't think it's exactly I'm going to work on being less angry. It's more I'm surrendering myself to God, and He's working on me.
Right. And Paul's pointing this, he doesn't say don't be angry. He's saying in your anger, don't sin. Don't let the sun go down on your anger. And he also says, and don't give the devil a foothold. And that unresolved anger very often becomes the devil's foothold, because if you're angry with your spouse, very often there are a lot of people who've gotten involved with somebody else because this unresolved anger, anger between parents and children or friends. There's been a lot of things where that anger, unresolved, unworked on, unconfessed, has now become a foothold and has led to bad things.
Well, that's scary when we start talking about how Satan enters the picture, which actually might be a good segue for what's going to happen next week, right? on Stories of Amazing Grace.
Oh, that's right. We aren't meeting next week.
That's
So
right.
Diane's off the hook.
So, right, I'm glad she doesn't have to come in. But
Yeah,
isn't it
yeah.
Steve Hemphill
Right.
talking
It's going to be
about
talking about spiritual warfare.
and Satan?
those,
And,
yeah. And he comes a lot out of Ephesians 6 and all that. But and I know it's about time to go, but I think you had a story. You told me before we got started you had a bear story. I don't know if that's you running bear in the backyard while you're cutting weeds or what.
Okay.
What's your bear story? It had to do with anger.
Well, quickly here. But see, I was trying to get you off the hook by leading into discussion about next week. But
And
you
I
want
think
me
that's good.
Okay.
So tune in, Stories of Amazing Grace
All
next
right.
week. Larry Souder, Steve Hemphill. It will be we'll be replaying that. It was a great one. Got a lot of interesting. But now Frank has a bedtime story for us as we get ready to sign off. Frank.
Okay. All right. Buttons the Bear. There was a time that we wrote, and we still have it, a curriculum for children to deal with their anger. Mm-hmm. And the main character was Buttons the bear, like pushing your button.
Ah.
And we had Buttons illustrated all throughout this material that we developed. And then someone made a big bear costume that I wore.
Ah.
That's a big bear.
That's a big bear.
And I don't know whatever happened to my Buttons the Bear costume. Maybe someone stole them. But I actually wore Buttons the Bear costume on Halloween from time to time.
Did you?
Yeah. So every time I hear the word button, I think of Buttons the Bear.
You know, if one of you will talk to Barbie Lanier and Sheldon, I bet they can find a bear costume. And if we can find it, if you'll dress up as a bear,
But
we could do a
that
whole
would be-
interview of you as Buttons the Bear and talk a little more
Buttons the
about
Bear.
anger.
Okay. We'll see about that.
Okay, I guess not. Bad
Okay.
idea.
All right.
Well, Frank and I are grateful to have you with us tonight, and I really wish that you were here so that it could be not just a discussion between two friends, but a discussion between a number of friends, and we can more further explore all this. But thank you for your prayers. I appreciate your praying for the elders. I know they're trying to figure out exactly when we can go back, come back, or at least begin that process. And I do remind you this, one of the things that makes their situation more complicated is we're in metropolitan Nashville. And so if you're in Hendersonville or Brentwood or outlying counties, they're in a different phase than Davidson County is. And so just pray for our elders. They're such good men, and they love this church. And I know this, they want to be back together with you and me and all of us. And so thank you for answering the survey. And they're working with all that. And hopefully we'll have something to tell you about those kind of plans very soon. But Frank, as we get ready to sign off tonight, would you lead us in a prayer, friend?
Sure. Father in heaven, we want to submit our wills to you. We want our lives to be guided by you.
Yes.
We want the Holy Spirit inside of us leading us. And please help us. That will take care of so many of these problems that we're talking about. Father, we do pray for wisdom for our personal lives, for our church family, on how to start reassembling again and doing it safely and well, and just give us wisdom on how to figure all of this out. Thank you for the great patience and love that has been shown by so many as we continue to social distance church and do online church, and maybe there are wonderful lessons and that we can get out of that, and we just pray that we can learn from this. We ask all of this through our Savior. Amen.
Amen. And by the way, before I say goodbye, one of the things I do want to say is this. I know that there probably are some of you who really struggle with anger. And it could be that our conversation has generated some feelings of guilt or shame about all that. And that's not our purpose. Our purpose is to create an awareness and the possibility that becomes part of your spiritual growth in Christ and that kind of invitation. And one of the things I would say to somebody who recognizes, I've got this problem and I need help, reach out to somebody who is capable of doing a good job with that. I mean, I don't want to put a lot on Frank's shoulders, but he certainly is good at that kind of thing. There are probably other
knew
people.
you were going to say that. Thank you.
But there are other people. But it really is that important to us.
It is
Frank's
important.
an elder. I work as the minister here, And I mean, it could be the thing that would really make a difference in one of those relationships that you have. And so if that's necessary, then maybe that's the work that God is saying we want you to do. But thank you for being with us tonight. Hope you'll plan to join us 9 o'clock on Sunday morning and be a part of our worship service. And we love you and we miss being with you. And thank you for being with us tonight.